All right, let's get right into it. Every now and then, a single year comes along that feels like it carries the weight of an entire decade. Well, according to some really sharp analysis from Eurasia Group and Lazard, 2026 is shaping up to be one of those years. We're talking about a moment of massive global uncertainty. But the reasons why, well, they might not be what you're thinking.
Eurasia Group just puts it out there, plain and simple. 2026 is a tipping point year. And look, this isn't just about a few small shifts here and there. We're talking about a fundamental pivot in the global order, a real turning point. And that idea, right there, sets the stage for everything else we're about to cover.
So here's what's so fascinating. You might think the big story is some new Cold War, maybe a hot war between the US and China, but the analysis says that's basically a red herring. The real story, the biggest risk of them all, actually starts from inside the very country that built the modern world system in the first place.
And that brings us right to our first section, America's political revolution. Because according to these sources, the internal politics of the United States aren't just a domestic issue anymore. Nope, they've become the absolute epicenter of global risk for 2026.
This is the core argument, and it's a huge one. For decades, whether you loved it or hated it, the world generally looked to the US as a source of stability. The analysis for 2026 completely flips that script. It argues the US is now the primary driver of instability.
So you're probably asking, how does this unwinding actually work? Well, the Eurasia Group report breaks it down into a pretty deliberate strategy. First, an attempt to dismantle traditional checks and balances. Then, you capture the non-political machinery of government itself. And third, you weaponize that machinery against your political opponents. On the world stage, this turns into something they've called the Donro Doctrine. Think of it as a modern, muscular take on the old Monroe Doctrine, basically asserting direct, unapologetic American control over the Western Hemisphere.
And this is where the story really starts to ripple outwards. Because these shockwaves coming from America, they don't just stop at the Atlantic Ocean. They're hitting Europe with the force of a geopolitical storm, and that creates our next major global risk.
This slide really lays out the dilemma for Europe perfectly. It's like a continent under siege from two directions at once. From the West, you've got an American retreat, which creates this massive security vacuum where alliances become purely about what's in it for me. And from the East, Russia sees a golden opportunity and advances, not with a traditional army, but with something far more insidious.
And that something is what the analysis is calling Russia's second front, hybrid warfare. And this is so important to understand. The most dangerous front is no longer just in the trenches of Ukraine. It's the war being fought inside NATO countries, using cyber attacks, political interference, disinformation, all of it designed to rot the alliance from within.
And here's the kicker. Just when Europe desperately needs to stand strong and united, its own foundation is cracking. The political center in its three biggest powers, we're talking Germany, France, and Italy, is collapsing. This internal weakness makes it almost impossible for the continent to pull together and fill that security void that the US is leaving behind.
Now, all this political instability has a direct and massive impact on the global economy. It's not separate. In fact, it's forcing a complete rewrite of the economic rulebook, which brings us to our third section.
The Lazard report gives this new era a name, the new economic nationalism. Let me tell you, this is not your parents' free market. It's a strategy that combines heavy-handed government intervention with that same transactional, self-interested deal-making we've been talking about. The age of just letting the market decide, yeah, that's pretty much over.
So what does this new playbook actually look like in practice? Well, first, you have governments actively picking winners and losers in the economy on a huge scale. Second, alliances are no longer about shared values. It's all about what have you done for me lately. And third, and this is so key, the government isn't just a referee on the sidelines anymore. It's a major player on the field, directly competing with and even directing corporations.
And all of this creates a really volatile global mix. On one hand, you have the US pushing this new model of high intervention. At the very same time, China is caught in a deflation trap, meaning prices at home are falling, which forces it to export its extra capacity, stuff like EVs and solar panels, at rock-bottom prices. And that, of course, sparks rising trade friction with Europe, which is now caught right in the middle of these two economic giants. It's a recipe for some serious conflict.
Okay, so what does it actually mean to navigate this new world? This more fragmented, more competitive, and frankly, more unpredictable world. How does anyone, a business, or even a country survive this?
Eurasia Group's president Ian Bremmer has this incredibly potent phrase for it. He calls it the law of the jungle. And that really says it all.
It's a world where the established rules are breaking down, where alliances are temporary, and where raw power, not principles, dictates what happens next.
So let's just boil this all down to 4 key takeaways for this new era we're entering. First, alliances are shifting from long-term partnerships to short-term deals. Second, securing your supply chains, especially for things like critical minerals, is now a top-tier national security issue. Third, get used to governments being much more involved in the economy. And finally, the big one. The era of a single superpower guaranteeing global stability is over.
And that leaves us with one final and pretty heavy question. For the better part of a century, there was a clear answer to who set the rules of the road. But as we head into 2026 and beyond, in a world that doesn't really have a global policeman anymore, the biggest question of all is this: who gets to write the new ones?